Clemente, and I welcome you to yet another edition of Cultural Caravan. On this edition, we're honored to be joined by Brother Kevin Sabio. Kevin is an author, an activist, and he's the author of a book called Raise Your Brown Black Fist, The Political Shouts of an Angry Afro-Latino. Welcome to Cultural Caravan, Kevin.
Thank you, Ms. Nancy, for having me.
All right.
Sister Louise.
Yes, it has been a pleasure. I know that, just talk to us about the cover of your book, the latest book. What do you mean by being an angry Afro-Latino?
Basically just being angry about our treatment, angry about our history, and also being able to talk about the issues that we face with the rest of our brothers and sisters in the diaspora, and also talking about ways where we could bridge gaps that separates us and be able to work together and come together as brothers and sisters.
Now let's go back for a moment. Give us some background. Tell us where you're from.
Actually, I'm born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. I'm the son of Honduran Garifuna immigrants, or in English, Garifuna. And so I'm also their youngest child. So there's three of us. I have an older sister and an older brother. So we grew up here in New York City. There's actually a sizable Honduran Garifuna community as well as other Afro-Latinos. So with me, my political ascension actually started when I was in my teen years. But I've always been surrounded by other political activities, specifically within the community that I grew up in. Because I actually grew up in East Flatbush. I was born in East New York, and then my family moved to East Flatbush in around 1980. And so being around other brothers and sisters in which Flatbush was becoming a primarily Caribbean neighborhood, because when we first moved there, there were still like a lot of Irish, Italians, and Jews. And then you saw the white flight happen, and then that's when our brothers and sisters from the Caribbean moved in. So I grew up around like a lot of diversity, brothers and sisters from Trinidad, from Jamaica. One of my neighbors was actually Irish and Puerto Rican. My other neighbors were from Haiti. My other neighbors down the block from them were actually from Colombia. So that really helped to broaden my perspective. And so for me, diversity was actually normal.
Yes. So, now, you said a lot, and for those who are not too familiar with what the Garifuna community in Honduras is, tell us about that.
Well, basically, the Garifuna actually started out in St. Vincent's. So there's a little bit of speculation of actually how we got there, but we actually developed there first. So I believe at that time, St. Vincent's was under, I believe, French control, and then I guess they had a battle or something with the English. English took over St. Vincent's, and so they had a war, and you say the English had a war against the Garifuna. And so unfortunately we ended up losing that war, and so because it was such a nasty fight and we ended up losing, they basically kicked the Garifuna out of St. Vincent's, and so we ended up along the Atlantic coast of Central America. So we ended up, the Garifuna ended up in Honduras, in Belize, in Guatemala, in I believe also Nicaragua, and I believe one other place that I can't think of off the top of my head.
Okay. Yeah. And the Garifuna is basically the Africans of African ancestry. Do you know what part of Africa the Garifuna trace?
That we do not know. At least personally for me, I do not know.
Okay.
I know somebody has actually done the research. I even know some family members who've actually done like a lot of really deep-seated research. I just don't know that particular information myself, what part of the continent we actually come from.
Now, when we think about Afro-Kin, as you know, the dominant groups in this city and this country are African, people of African ancestry, African Americans, and Latinos. But it's not until recent when people realize that there are a sizable African population that went to what we see Spanish-speaking countries. Talk to us a bit about that history of Africans moving into in a presence in Latin America? Well,
number one, people got to understand, with the Western Hemisphere, this entire hemisphere was a slave plantation. So the triangular slave trade, as they called it, wasn't just Europe, Africa, and then the United States. It was basically Europe, Africa, the Caribbean, South America, Central America, and what is now the United States, North America. So we got dropped everywhere. So it was the French, it was the English, the Spanish, the Dutch, and the Portuguese. And I believe the Swedes and a few other people. So basically everybody from Europe came over here, and for that free labor, after they decimated the indigenous population, they brought the Africans here to do the work.
How would you say was the treatment of people of African ancestry in Spanish-speaking colonies and countries?
It was definitely harsh. I think one of the other things about it is that in certain respects, we were able to still retain a lot of our African ancestry, a lot of our African culture, because when people look at Santeria or Candomblé, that is actually Yoruba in another name. So a lot of people will be out there and they will try to say, oh, well, that's actually a mix of Catholicism and African spirituality. No, it is also African spirituality. It was slavery. They were trying to remove our culture from us so that we could be a culture that becoming slaves. We wanted to retain that. So they are thinking that this person is praying to St. Michael. They're like, no, that's, I believe, Shango. This person is praying to this other idol. No, that's Elegua. No, they're trying to pray to this other slave idol, Catholic idol. No, that's Yemeya. So basically all they did was that they disguised with their African culture, and they let the slave masters believe, oh, okay, they're becoming docile. They're becoming enculturated. We're able to get into their minds. It's like, no, we're still retaining our African culture. Even certain dance styles that are done can actually be derived from some of our African ancestry, because we came from what is now known as Nigeria, from the area of Congo, what is now known as Angola, and certain other parts of like what is now known as Western Africa. And we're sent over here. So some of us were actually able to maintain our African culture and our music and things like that. But we just, in certain ways, we disguised it. In other ways, we just, it was actually adopted by our slave masters.
Exactly. We know here in America that it impacted us a lot in terms of our identity, in terms of how we accepted or didn't accept or have a hard time accepting ourselves. How did it impact the Afro-Latino in terms of accepting their Afrocentricity?
Well, in certain ways, some of us do accept our African roots, and in other ways, a lot of us do not. So we do also suffer that psychological damage. What was it called? Post-traumatic slave syndrome. So we got that just as much as our brothers and sisters in the United States. So it's just, especially in certain respects, one thing for our brothers and sisters in the United States, segregation was legal. So it was laws in the books for that. With outside of the United States, basically it was de facto. So once slavery did end, for us, a lot of times it was like, okay, this is your place. It was just an unspoken rule. Whereas in the United States, it was like, no, there were laws. You actually have to sit in the back of the bus. You're not allowed to live here. You're not allowed to live there. And also, it's just a lot of additional psychological damage was done. Like, in order to kind of move up in society, in certain ways, you can do it with money, even though not very many of us were actually able to achieve certain financial successes. So a lot of it was what's called blanqueamiento, or basically whitening the race, or mejorando la raza, which also means literally bettering the race. So one way of doing that is kind of like basically marrying somebody who's light-skinned or white. And so when your children are born, they're actually born lighter skinned than you are, and so that kind of makes them able to kind of like move up the social ladder.
Okay. Now, the interesting thing you mentioned about that whole thing, when most people really didn't, until recently, the last 20 years, realize that there is a sizable African population in countries like Colombia, Puerto Rico, and other places. But one of the reasons why a lot of people didn't realize is because of the media.
Right.
When you look at Latin media, you very rarely see a black person, a person of African ancestry.
Right.
Why is that?
Racism, basically. We don't exist. You don't even see a more brown skinned, kind of mestizo looking Latino on the at least the two big major ones, Univision and Telemundo. So it's like you do not see any dark-skinned people, much less you say Afro-Latinos, on primarily mainstream Latino media. And so the funny thing about that is, like, I actually know two young Afro-Latina activists. They're actually sisters. They have an organization called Proyecto Más Calor, in which they're actually fighting so that we could have representation specifically on the two main Latino networks that are here. But it's like you go down the line, whether they're HD channels or the two major ones, it's like you do not see Afro-Latinos or even just dark-skinned Latinos represented at all in the mainstream media. We actually have to fight for that ourselves.
Wow. That's interesting because, as you know, African Americans have fought for that, and certainly we're still dealing with certain aspects of colorism as it is. But that is something that, unfortunately, in this day and age, we still have our Afro-Latino brothers and sisters not getting equal opportunities to share. And that's why people didn't know that there were Afro-Latinos until recently when they meet brothers and sisters. Now, one of the things that there are some very high profile, successful Afro-Latino actors, actresses. You think of Laz Alonso, Melissa De Seuss, we talked about, Zoe Saldana, Rosario Dawson. These individuals, in most cases, they do portray African Americans in mainstream media because, you know, you do have a variety of different looks and it's more, but what is the challenges of particularly, what is your perception of those that you do see currently in high profile positions and so forth?
A lot of them, they struggle a lot because even if you're able to interview them, they will tell you most of the times the reason why they primarily play African American roles, that's the only thing that's being offered to them. Because even if there's a role that's offered for a Latina or a Latino, they will not get hired for that. And they've gone on record saying that in numerous interviews. It's like, because I remember one particular interview, there was a movie back in, that came out in 1994. It was I Like It Like That. I remember Lauren Velez, she was even saying after the movie came out and she finally got her shine, that it was very hard for her as an actress because a lot of times she would go into to audition for certain roles and she would not get them because they're like, yo, nah, you don't even look like that. And she's like, how are you telling me I look like that?
Exactly.
I happen to be one. And so with a lot of them, even, okay, Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, Carlton and Ashley. Tatiana Ali played Ashley, Alfonso Ribeiro, got to say, roll the R. They're both Afro-Latinos, and they're playing African-American roles. And I remember Alfonso Ribeiro from back, yes, I'm showing my age, back in the day when he was a tap dance king. And when he was on Silver Spoons. And so it's like, if you look at it for most of the career, yes, he's had to play an African-American, just like a lot of other Afro-Latino actors. That's 9 times out of 10 their way into the business. They almost will not get, now it's different, but especially back in the day, they almost will not get hired to play a Latino, whether TV or film. Not unless they produce the film themselves.
Wow. And so now that you have some very influential, successful Afro-Latino actors who have played African Americans, I guess their voice needs to be louder. You need, coming from them, those who are successful, making lots of money. Now, most of them have been receiving roles as African Americans and maybe they don't feel it matters, but particularly to open the door for others to show Latino news organizations that yes, there are Afro-Latinos who buy products, who are interested in being given the same type of opportunities to be identified. So that's definitely something. Now, we talked about that whole thing of the similarities and the differences in terms of our experiences. What would you say some of the major similarities and differences are between the experience of an Afro-Latino versus African-American?
Basically, an African-American can get accepted as an African-American. We will not be looked at as a Latino. That is one major thing, because I can, myself, my family members, other people that I know that are Afro-Latinos, and it's like they could walk into a bodega or something full of other Latinos who are of a lighter hue, and people will assume they're African-American and will probably talk about them in Spanish.
Oh, wow.
They're saying whatever stuff under their breath or publicly thinking that they're African-American, they won't understand, and they will get cursed out, if not knocked out, for doing something like that.
Wow,
because I've known, you say, myself, my Spanish is actually limited, but I do understand more than what I speak. But I've known other friends who've literally gotten into fist fights because somebody says something smart out their mouth in Spanish, and then they hit them. It goes back.
Wow.
mira baboso, yo soy un Latino. It's just like, you're like, yo, how dare you talk about me just because you're assuming I'm something else?
Wow, wow. So that's real. So you mean in terms of the perceptions, in terms of the racism that
Right.
exists within the Latino community, which
Right.
not all of us would know, because unless
Right.
you speak Spanish, you
Right.
wouldn't know.
Right.
I've been in situations where, although I, understand some, but where little things have been said that you may not understand it, but I said, gosh, I wish I knew a little more.
Right.
I have a relative, she speaks it, she's very fluent.
Right.
So she can speak it very well. But you're right, that there is that gap. And it's unfortunate that even within the Latino community, racism exists. And so, and that goes into the whole thing, as you know, segregation is
Right.
is a big thing in the U.S. history of
Right.
African people coming out of slavery, being segregated,
Right.
fighting for civil rights. What would you say, looking at segregation in U.S. versus Latin style, how does that impact?
I believe I said this before. With segregation here in the United States, it was legal. Segregation in Latin America was de facto. So it was more of an idea. So how can you kind of fight against an idea when it's basically, you're just told you can't go here, period, end of story. That's how you know, that's how you've been trained. It's been ingrained in your mind. Whereas at least here in the United States, yeah, you were able to fight against that, go to court, you say, and gain back your rights. Not even just gain some rights, gain back your rights as a human being for human dignity, your human right to be recognized. That's a little different in Latin America, no matter what country you go into, because we're still fighting for our rights today.
Wow. And so when you think about the fact that, as you said, there's still a fight to gain human rights, even amongst Afro-Latinos, I'm going to talk about the perceptions, because I mean, I've ran into, there's some people say there's some Latin communities that are very understood, Afro-Latino community, that know they're African and they embrace it. There are others which, you'll walk up to someone who looks like any other African-American brother, sister, and you'll call them black and they're ready to fight you, because I was told that in some cases in the Latin community, Latin America, they were told one drop of white blood made you white, regardless of your pigmentation, whereas in in America, you were told one drop of black blood made you black, regardless of whether you looked as white as white.
Right.
So let's talk about the perceptions of people of race, particularly amongst Afro-Latinos at this point.
Well, part of it is the one drop rule. The other part of it is that for a lot of us, we're taught that our nationality is our race.
Oh, okay.
So for a lot of us, it's like not even just not accepting their blackness. It's like, I'm not black, I'm Ecuadorian, or I'm not black, I'm Dominican. You're saying I'm whatever your nationality is, and it's like you're a black. You're saying Dominican, Salvadoran, whatever. You say you're still black. Yes, you're from El Salvador. Nobody's not saying that, or whatever country you hail from, but you're still African. Because that's something that I actually dealt with a lot in college. And I also wrote that particular article in Razor Brown Black Fist. I call that particular article "The Color Line." In which I talk about that particular issue. And so, like, I've had lots of fights with other Afro-Latinos who, like, will deny to the death and will fight you rather than accept their African heritage and culture. Whereas with others, they're just like, what up, bro?
Exactly. And the interesting thing, you'll find that some cases, the more lighter skinned Latino will accept their Afrocentricity than the darker one, who you think is very obvious, and they're the ones running away from it. Now,
I had some friends in high school back in the day, they were wearing like the wooden medallions of Nefertiti's head or a black fist on it or something. They're like, yo, I'm black and I'm proud.
And because a lot of them grew up up in home, like you said, the religion, they know the culture of Latino communities is African. There's a preservation. A lot of our Yoruba, Nigerian, culture is very heavily there.
Yeah. Also, with the fact, let me just throw this in real quick. You do have some long-standing Latino communities that have actually been here for a very long time. So they were actually here during segregation. So it's the fact that they're able to come here to the United States. They knew about segregation, and one, they were always accepting of for a number of them, they were accepting of their African roots. But when they got here to the United States, for some of them, it's like, oh, I didn't even really know I was black until I got to the United States, and then I had to sit in the back of the bus. So they've actually been there for like the Black Power struggle, the Civil Rights movement, and the end of segregation.
Wow. And so that's the thing, and I think particularly because both of our communities, being in the city, being in this country, are fighting for civil rights and human rights.
Right.
That there's so much need for us to work together,
Right.
to see ourselves, to accept ourselves. And so that's why I think the work you're doing in terms of bridging the gap,
Right.
providing a forum for conversations, particularly through your books. Tell us about just a summary of your books real quick for the last few minutes. What are your books about?
Raise Your Brown Black Fist is a collection of articles that are originally written online. They were posted on a website that is no longer around called blacklatino.net. So it's actually a collection of 2 of the article series that are written for them. The first one was called Black versus Brown, which basically talks about the supposed beef between the African American and Latino communities and put it in its proper historical perspective. And the second article series was called Black Thoughts, a political ideological perspective for Afro-Latinos, which basically talks about why Latinos of African descent should embrace the ideology of Pan-Africanism and Black nationalism. And so one of the other things that I've actually done in conclusion with my book was I did a program that was called the Consortium of Afro-Latino Communities, which basically it basically talked about the roots. It highlighted the roots and heritage of Afro-Latinos through books, through films, and through discussions. And I was able to do that successfully from 2012 when I was living in Baltimore to when I came back to New York in 2015. Well, I came back to New York in 2014, but the last one I held was 2015.
You've also done some some recent work.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Yes, Drum Speaking Tales from an Inner City Grill. It's actually my short story anthology. So I'm actually writing a bunch of different short stories. I actually do have one that stars an Afro-Latino. It's more of a science fiction one. It's called The Adventures of Don Fierro Valiente. So it's basically about an Afro-Latino space knight and the trials and tribulations that he goes through having to work in this particular system as a soldier, but also being the fact that he's basically an anomaly because he's the only one of African descent who's actually working in this organization.
Wow.
Yes.
And I think it's so great to hear the voices and the fact that you really provide an opportunity for people to see that there's a large lot of information. For those who are interested in finding out about more about the works you do, do you have a website, email address?
Definitely, you can email me at brownblackfist.book@gmail.com. I also have a blog page, Chronicles of the Brown Black Fist Chronicles.blogspot.com. And also, I'd like to give a shout out to a lot of my peoples who are actually also doing the work. Sisters from Chicago called Boricua Chicks. They do a lot. Alicia Anabel Santos and Renzo Devia, they've done a documentary called Afro-Latinos, The Untaught Story. Definitely give a shout out to them. I've known them since about 2011, and that docu-series, I really hope that they get a chance to actually get it on air. Janelle Martinez, she actually also has a blog, I believe, a website actually called AintILatina.com. She's a fellow Afro-Latina, a fellow Honduran, actually. And so she's also putting in a lot of work. Also a sister named Tamika Burgess, she does her own e-magazine, Es Mi Cultura. So for a lot of us, we're doing the work, we're putting our stories out there. And so I want to give a shout out to all my other fellow Afro-Latinos who are also putting in the hard work as well as myself, and Afro-Latino Forum and Afro-Latino Project.
Well, again, I want to thank you, Kevin, for the work you do in terms of enlightening the community and really letting them know the lens of what it is to be African and Latino, and how we as a people in general should come together to understand each other, to work past the stereotypical images that are out there, and to build a community. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
I realized that to learn about the people, you study the dance. And when you study the dance, you learn the history of the people, because dance in traditional African cultures used to preserve, and so that the young coming forth learn by age group. And as I said, you know, I'm skipping years. In traditional African cultures, you learn by age group. So you would have the toddlers who will be going around, they aren't paying any attention, but they are, because these rhythms are becoming a part. And then as they go into the initiation rites, everything is explained. Then after the initiation, then they are ready for courtship and marriage, and then maybe baby naming ceremonies, and on and up until time they make the transition to the grand ancestral grounds.